Okay. Sorry, that was too enthusiastic. We're going to talk about responding to serial murder today. And predominantly, we're going to be talking about criminal profiling. Yes. So, one thing that we don't often think about, and frankly, I never really thought about it until I started going to graduate school, etc. But when it comes to what are some of the consequences of dealing with major cases? And you never really think about stuff like the media's impact, resource management's like, for instance, just dealing with the Green River Killer cost about $20 million in resources, right? You have human resources, you have to manage and collect and deal with evidence. Like, it's not super cheap to just send off DNA evidence and doing, gunshot analyses and getting all these special folks to come and look at your evidence and determine whether it is related to certain crimes or not. So, like, the technology aspect of it is also expensive. And the problem is that when you have the media focusing on, like a big time murder case, like the Green River Killer or Ted Bundy or whoever else, the people are they create the sense of urgency and pressure on the police to act fast. So the police will quickly throw around money to do whatever they can to get a crime solved. And sometimes when you're too quick, when you're making a knee-jerk decision, it might not always be the most efficient or effective decision, and therefore it ends up costing people a lot of money. Another issue is that serial killers don't necessarily say, you know what, I'm going to keep it in the jurisdiction of Seattle so that way I don't make it difficult for the police to catch me. Everything happens within their own jurisdiction. It's one police agency. It'll make it nice and easy for them to catch me. No, that's not how it works. Oftentimes, crime doesn't respect the boundaries of jurisdiction. And because of America's fragmented policing system, it's kind of, at least up until 2001, when 9/11 happened, with the Patriot Act, interdepartmental communication has always been a bit of an issue. Not only do you get people who don't really want to share case details, people have their pride and stuff, but also there might be different standards across different police agencies. Like if someone committed a crime in Buffalo, right, but then they also committed crimes out in some of the more rural counties around it, and now those rural sheriff's offices or police departments have to communicate with the police from Buffalo, it might not, the standards might not be the same, right? You have some of these small town police officers have different ways of doing things compared to these big city level police officers. And then when you have the federal government and the state government get involved, everybody, gets their feelings hurt or wants to own a piece of the investigation, and it just makes everything get slower. So when you have these multi-jurisdictional crimes, like many serial killers, the cooperation between these myriad agencies can be sometimes a bit of a hassle. And when you watch Mindhunters, you'll see some of that in some of the cases that they deal with. Especially in season 2, you see a lot more of that when they're in Atlanta and they're trying to deal with catching this person, and then there's a lot of pushback from the Atlanta police and then the state police, etc. Then also, these cases are not usual; they're unusual, meaning that these aren't things that the police see every day, right? Think about, I worked at Domino's Pizza for like 8 years. When I was in college and in high school, even some in grad school, and you get used to making pizzas, right? Oh, pepperoni pizza, okay, it's like second nature. You know where everything is, but every now and then you get that weird person that's like, I don't want any sauce on my pizza. and I want pineapples, and I want jalapenos and spinach, and it's just like the oddest combination. And then it like throws you off because you're not used to it, and it takes you longer, right? Because you're not, it's not second nature to you. Another thing is at Domino's, they would, every now and then you'd have people, so Domino's, I don't know if you know, but they use cornmeal to slap their dough in. That's why when you get the Domino's crust, it's always kind of like yellowy, because they just slap it in cornmeal. And so every now and then there'd be this person who would order a pizza from us, and they'd be like, oh yeah, I'm allergic to corn. And we'd be like, oh, great. And so when we had to slap out their dough, we had to do it in a completely different slapping station, and we had to use wheat flour to slap it out in, and we had to it was such a pain in the butt. It was unusual. And so similarly, when the police deal, most of the time most murders, first of all, murders aren't even that common. Now, every police agency has a murder at least once a year, I'd say, across the country, some obviously more than others. But murder is, in itself, only comprises less than 1% of all crime in the United States. So it's already not something that they do a lot. And when there is a murder, it often has to do with either domestic violence or some sort of instrumental gain. So it could be, most of the time in our reality, it has to do with drugs, drug sale gone wrong, or robbery gone wrong, or something like that. Murder very seldom occurs just because someone really wants to do it, like serial killers might. So it's just completely unusual to them. The evidence, they're not used to working with it. The type of victim might be very shocking to them, especially if it's a child. And then the locations, they're just not used to it, right? Most murders occur in hotspots, but many murders occur in hotspots, right? So you have, all of us know there are certain neighborhoods where you avoid because you're more likely to get shot there, right? And so the police are also used to that, right? And so now all of a sudden they're in a completely different neighborhood. They're not used to the people. They're not used to the type of crime scene there. It just throws you off your game, right? So when these serial murders happen, and especially in the 1970s and 80s when they were happening a lot and they were getting a lot of media attention, it really shakes things up. And it's not easy for police agencies to deal with them, right? And then you have the media that can sometimes be unforgiving towards the police, but at the same time, the police are also, by saying they are the police, they are sort of admitting or implying that they are more adept than the average person at dealing with these things, and therefore you would expect some results. So, but yeah, so there's all kinds of things that happen. But what we're going to focus on today is how do the police respond to serial murder? And while there are investigations and forensic science and all this stuff, we're going to focus on a subset of responses, which is profiling, right? So the police will investigate, and investigations often involve some form of forensic science. And if you want to know more about forensic science, there's myriad classes being offered right now on that. But if you, so this is only going to focus on a portion of forensic science, which we call profiling. All right. So profiling, unlike what we might expect or think, or how the media might portray it, does not just involve serial killing or murder, right? It goes beyond that. Profiling has been used to understand women who are incarcerated. It's been used to understand domestic violence and domestic violence victims and elderly victims and those people who attack the elderly, or those people who are more likely to engage in domestic violence. It's given us great insights, right? And the reason why we profile is that sometimes, the police have their way of doing their investigations, right? They have their way of doing police investigations. And sometimes there's just not enough hard evidence, right? Or you run out of leads. And so when you complement traditional investigation techniques with profiling, it might it just allows the investigator to come at it from a different angle. It might highlight a different suspect that the evidence did not clearly point towards, who you can then investigate, right? So most of the time you get a crime scene and then you work from the crime scene, you talk to witnesses, you look through the phone records, and then you work from there. But sometimes all that evidence dries up and it doesn't get you anywhere else. And so when you have a profiler come in, or you have a police officer conduct profiling, they might say, oh, what about a person that looks like this? And then maybe you ask someone close to the victim, do they know a person who does X, Y, and Z? Yes, this person. And then when you start looking at that particular person as a suspect that the evidence didn't normally point towards, it might generate some new leads. And that's really the one of the primary purposes of profiling. And that's why when the FBI comes in to a local jurisdiction and they do some profiling, that's often what happens, right? They bring that fresh perspective. The way to really think about criminal profiling is that there are many profiling techniques that you use to create what the person looks like. This is their profile. And then when you interview a suspect, you say, how much do they fit our profile? Right? And that might give you, although it might not give you admissible evidence in court, it might give you that hunch to push that person more in an interview, right? Has anyone ever seen The First 48? You watch some of those interviews and it's like, man, if they had just shut their mouths, they might not have gotten arrested just now, right? The police are so good at getting you to talk to them. And so my advice to you is always, no matter what it is, even if you are innocent as hell, police talk to you, they try to interrogate you, the only word you ever say to them is lawyer. Even if and you know what they'll say to you? They'll be like, well, people who are not guilty will not ask for lawyers. They will talk to us. Lawyer, lawyer, lawyer. You can talk to my lawyer, right? Whether you asked for a lawyer or not will do nothing in court. It'll impact that decision not at all. Okay. Anyway, so what we're going to do is, moving forward, we're going to talk about different types of profiling. Now, understand that profilers typically do all of these things all at once when they generate their profile. In some cases, you have more specialized profilers who just focus on offender profiling, psychological profiling, or geographic profiling. But for the most part, when you have a profiler, they use all of these different tools to come up with the offender profile, because sometimes there's more evidence of psychological stuff compared to paraphilic stuff, compared to geographical stuff or victim stuff. Okay, so that is what we're going to move into. So the first type of profiling is offender profiling. So right off the bat, this is not very grounded in science. And that's something that we're going to encounter a lot with profiling techniques, is that because you don't have serial killers that are just everywhere, it's kind of difficult to really hone the practice of profiling in a scientific manner, and then also studying whether it's effective or not. Also, offender profiling can open doors to discrimination, right? Especially when it comes to the already fragile relationship between the police and minority communities. But one model that has some scientific backing is the Radex model that I want to discuss. And so this picture you can see here on the PowerPoint is a depiction of what the Radex model should look like. And so essentially the way that the Radex model works is that it looks at the types of crimes that have been committed. It looks at offenders, serial killing offenders, and it says, what are some general things? So here in the middle, you see some things that are pretty general, right? That a lot of killers will do, right? Overkill, beat someone up, rape, leave the victim alive for sex, pose the body afterwards, conceal the body. There's not a weapon there. So these are certain things that you might get with many types of murders. But as you go out of these circles, things get more and more specific. And then the more specific they become, you can then start to categorize killers into different types of offenders. And so now if you go to a new crime scene and you find a victim, right, that's been killed by a firearm or manual strangulation, right, you might be like, and maybe also burned. I don't know. You might be like, oh, that was an executioner, right? That was an execution style killing. Or maybe you find the person badly mutilated, right? Maybe even decapitation or some missing parts. You might be like, okay, this is a killing motivated by mutilation. So what does that tell you about maybe the relationship between the victim and the offender, right? What does that tell you about the type of offender, right? If I was like, then there's also the homicide profile index that you guys can look up on your own. But yeah, the Radex model, I think it's pretty cool, the way that it starts off with very general things, and then by using existing crimes, right? So it uses existing cases and it builds on that. And so when a new crime happens, someone can look at that and be like, oh, and you can sort of see how specific your current offender that you're seeking is. Victim profiling is also very important because depending on understanding your victim might help you figure out what type of person your offender is. One thing that we find is that certain lifestyles tend to be associated with increasing your chance of being a victim. People who, because of their lifestyle, want to avoid the police are much more likely to be killed. That's why prostitutes are so easily murdered and drug dealers are so easily murdered, because they want to avoid being seen. Right? So if you engage in already illegal activity that causes you to stay away from society or away from detection, then you increase those chances. Also, younger men tend to be more likely to be victimized compared to older women. But then there's like up in the 50s and 60s or so, there's like this slight increase in being victimized for instrumental reasons and for violent reasons when you're older. Yeah, so race and ethnicity. One thing that we find is that typically, and this is not always the case, but typically a rule of thumb is that people like to kill people of their own race. But when it comes to serial killing, those rules don't always apply. But there's still some validity to it. So you do, for the most part, people kill intra-racially. But there are also some groups that are more likely to kill interracially, and that's something you can look up in the book on your own. The thing, though, is that victim profiling, offender profiling, and some of the other techniques we're going to be discussing all need to be taken into account at the same time, right? That gives you insights into who to talk to. Crime scene profiling is where you focus predominantly on what the crime scene looks like and what you can glean from that about who your suspects might be. This is probably the most glaring, the more quintessential example of criminal profiling that's depicted in the media. A lot of this is what you see in the show Mindhunter and other shows centered on profiling. Essentially, this is where we get the whole typification between organized and disorganized killers. So when you look at a crime scene, right? Think about this for a second. The way that you do anything in your life, like, you know how like some people, here's the example I use a lot. You know when you get into someone's car, it looks like a freaking tornado went off in it, right? And you go into their house, and that looks messy, and there's not. You look at maybe the outside of their house; it's not weeded well. The grass is long, right? Things are dirty, or not necessarily dirty, but just disorganized. Or you get some people that are total neat freaks, right? You look into like there's some professors I've worked with. You look at their offices and it's perfect, and then you get a ride with them somewhere and you look at their cars and everything is clean, and I almost feel like I don't want to breathe too hard in their car because I feel like I would make it disorganized, right? When you come into my office, you usually see I have papers all over the place because I'm pretty crazy, but I'm relatively a pretty disorganized person, and so just like everything else in your life, your crime scene would probably reflect that as well. And scientific research is kind of mixed but underdeveloped when it comes to whether these profiling techniques actually work or not. But for the most part, we typically will typify the sophistication of a serial killer by whether they were organized or disorganized, right? To what extent were they organized? To what extent were they disorganized? So an example of a very organized killer would be the BTK killer. He was very organized, very methodical, didn't leave a lot of evidence around, staged some of his crime scenes, right? He was very much in control of what was happening. A disorganized killer would be like Richard Ramirez, who would just totally freaking destroy people, right? Or Ed Kemper was super disorganized, right? He would mutilate the bodies and just all this abundance of evidence everywhere, right? And you don't have to be disorganized and leave evidence, but it just, when you decapitate or dismember someone and you leave everything around, I mean, it's pretty. There's a high chance of there being evidence, but nonetheless. So if you are organized in every other aspect of your life, you might be also organized in the way that you kill people, right? You might be very methodical, very clean about it. So Dexter Morgan, he's extremely organized, a very, very organized killer. I'd say the guy from You, Joe, not very much organized killer. Like, he cleans up relatively well, but his killings are not as planned as Dexter Morgan's, right? So the organized killer will put a lot of thought into it. They'll pick very selective of their victims. They'll stalk them for a while, and then they'll pick the right time to kill them. Like when they interviewed Dennis Rader, who is the BTK killer, he said he oftentimes had to just abandon a kill. And there were some people who he never ended up coming back to kill. He'd be like, he'd get close to it. It'd be the day of, and he'd be like, oh, nope, this is not going to work at all. Right? And that takes a lot of impulse control, right? To be able to, because if you're about to get something you've been fantasizing about for months, and then you get right there and you're like, oh no, this is not going to work at all. And then you backtrack and you got to start all over again, right? It's not easy. Whereas disorganized killers wouldn't necessarily put all that much thought into it, and they might kill someone very violently, leave the bodies around, leave the bodies in pieces, not try to clean up much of the evidence or the surrounding crime scene. So, with that being said, then, if you leave a disorganized crime scene, the police might, as they're interviewing suspects, determine, well, which of these suspects also seem kind of disorganized in other aspects of their lives. Like, what does their clothing look like? When you're interviewing them in the interrogation room, are they sitting there organizing the packets of cigarettes in the ashtray and their water, or are they just letting it everywhere? Are their nails clean or not? Do they have perfectly combed hair, etc.? Right. So those are some things to consider. Psychological profiling is where you try to figure out what does the behavior that you see at the crime scene, or that you maybe see in the way that the victim is killed, tell us about the psychological description of the offender. So what does the crime scene tell us about their personality, right? And so once you can get a personality from the way that the crime scene looks, and now you have potential suspects, you can say, well, to what extent does that personality that we found correspond to some of the personality traits in the suspect, right? If you find a crime scene that's very, very clean, the bodies have been taken somewhere else, and thoroughly clean and almost packaged, like the ice truck killer, right? You might anticipate that person might have a certain personality traits, right? Being very, very reserved. They might even be a psychopath. And so when you're communicating with your suspects, you can compare that psychological profile to them. And geographical profiling is probably one of the profiling techniques that has the most scientific evidence behind it. And this focuses predominantly just on where are the people killed and where are bodies found, right? And so it focuses a lot on distance, mobility, demographics, and mental maps, right? And so this geographical profiling has left us with 4 offender styles, so 4 types of people who kill. Or there are 4 ways that killers use geography to their advantage, or just whatever. So you get the hunter, right? So that's someone who kills someone, a specific victim. So this is someone that they've been stalking for a while. A while could be 5 days, it could be 3 hours, it could be 2 years or 6 months. Like, I think the BTK killer would stalk people for like months. And it's usually within the local area where the offender lives. So the offender is close by. A poacher is someone who travels away from where they live to kill people. Now, this is difficult. You have to be very, very confident in when you're a poacher, because when you're a hunter, that makes sense, right? You know every single street where you're living. You're comfortable, right? It's your comfort zone. I mean, think about that feeling you get when you come back from a road trip and you're finally like, you come off the highway and you're taking the exit and you're driving around in your hometown as you're getting to your house, right? It's this feeling of familiarity and comfort just washes over you, right? And so it's because you know the area, you know what to expect. There's more certainty for you. So being a poacher, that's extremely difficult, right? So oftentimes these people will actually get to know some of these other areas that are far away from them, right? And so these people travel away, and it does eliminate them to some extent from suspicion. When you're just snatching someone away from where you live, you might not even be considered a suspect. And then you have your trollers. So these are people who are just going about their lives, and they see the perfect opportunity to kill someone, they'll just take it, right? So again, you can see how there's some overlap now between when you look at when you look at the type of geographical profiling, there's some overlap with psychological, like what types of people would be hunters versus poachers. What are some personality traits you might expect to see in a poacher as opposed to a hunter? Or at the same time, you might want to say to yourself, would a hunter be more disorganized or organized compared to a poacher, right? Or what about a troller, right? You'll have disorganized and organized trollers, but again, by combining all these profiling techniques, it narrows down what a suspect might look like, right? Might be. So troller, opportunistic, they'll catch someone as they're just going about their day. And then a trapper is someone who, they can be a poacher or a hunter, but they usually will set some sort of a trap for someone. So they're in complete control of what's happening, right? Again, complete control, I would expect that to be more of a organized killer, right? You plan things out pretty well. You know where someone's going to be at a certain time of day, and then you catch them. The problem with profiling is, like we've explained, there's not a lot of scientific rigor necessarily. And so we need to wait for science to really catch up and tell us which of these profiling techniques work better than others, which things don't actually work at all, right? When it comes to profiling, just because someone fits the profile doesn't mean that they're the ones who committed it, right? It's kind of like if you think about someone who's had bad socialization and had a brain injury, it doesn't necessarily make them a serial killer. It's just many serial killers have had both of those things happen to them, right? So just because it goes one way doesn't mean it goes the other way, right? And so that's the thing with you might construct a criminal profile of someone, and it might point glaringly at 2 or 3 people, but it might not be them who did it. And also, your profile might sometimes be wrong. They're not perfect, but the more you do them and the more you evaluate them, the better they become. It's kind of like a Netflix algorithm, right? Sometimes Netflix will suggest the dumbest shows for me to watch, and then I go and I give it a thumbs down, and I tell Netflix, no, dude, get your frickin' algorithm right, because I'm not watching Nailed It, okay? And then when it comes to sometimes the police themselves, like police investigators, especially like think about you're a local investigator working on a crime, working your ass off on this crime, you're super stressed about it, and now the FBI comes in, they have this hot, flashy profiler dude who wants to come tell you how to do your job. And they come up with some mumbo jumbo, they weren't even at the scenes, they didn't see the dead people, they just looked at your case files and they come up with some profile of who might have done it, right? That might be a pretty big blow to your ego, number one, but it might not follow your intuition as an investigator. And so it's very hard sometimes for investigators to trust in profiles or trust profilers, especially when it's a multi-jurisdictional thing or they're coming from somewhere else. And also profiling might cause discriminatory behavior. After all, you are in a way stereotyping, right? You're saying, look, based on the crime scene, this is the type of person who did it, right? And so you might start thinking, well, these types of people do these types of things, right? And so it might lead to discriminatory behavior. Nonetheless, when it comes to profiling, there is a nexus between craft and science. And what I mean by that is a lot of what we know about serial killers and psychology and geographical profiling all comes from some form of scientific inquiry and scientific process and discovery. So there is this scientific tie to this. But there's also an art or a craft aspect to being a profiler. There is a point in time where you focus on your intuition. And so profiling really is both a craft and a science, where it's your gut feeling with what science says. And until we can really further evaluate profiling techniques and validate them or rule them out, it's going to remain this dance between these two opposing forces.